Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our very important discussion about developmental language disorder, or DLD. As some of you already know, DLD affects between 1 in 7 and 1 in 14 individuals, depending which piece of research you are unlucky enough to read, and that makes it far more common than we might actually have thought it was. It's certainly not a piece of language that I remember hearing when I was back in school and working as a SENCO. It's a piece of language that's become more prevalent over the last few years. Our aim today is to try and improve your awareness of that, and to help me do that we have got an amazing group of panellists to support us. So we have Angharad Welsh from Find the Key Speech and Language Therapy. She's got extensive experience up there, one of my corners, that one there. She's got extensive experience working with children with DLD and will help us to understand some of those intricacies of the condition. We have got Martha Currie, who's oh gosh, the screen's flipped, it's moved, she's on that side, from Mabel Therapy, who's going to share some insights for us as well, and some strategies to help support children. We have Collighan from Speech and Language Link. I'll get it right in a minute. My fingers are going in all directions. And she's going to cover some of those key signs of DLD for us and offer some advice about identification and diagnosis. And we have got Sally Wells from Widget Software. I got it right in the end. Yeah, I get to dab for you. Is that the right one? And Sally's going to highlight the vital role that visual tools such as symbols can play in supporting our students with DLD. So I have some questions, and they have been prompted with these questions already, and I'm going to go to Angharad first of all with, can you help us to understand what developmental language disorder is and why it's important that educators and parents are aware of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason you might not be as familiar with the term DLD is because for a long time it was sort of the same thing as SLI, specific language impairment. So if you've been in SEN a while, you might be a bit more familiar with that terminology. DLD's been around a little while, but in terms of getting practice and terminology changes out there, it can take decades, can't it, to get things well accepted. So DLD is relatively new as these things go. And DLD is a developmental condition. We put the word developmental in there. That indicates it starts in childhood, and it's a lifelong difficulty. So DLD is diagnosed by a persistent language difficulty, and by language that can cover quite a lot of bases. So children, young people and adults with DLD might have difficulties with understanding various aspects of language, so vocabulary, grammar, developing understanding of grammatical structures, and developing the understanding of language at a more sort of narrative and conversational level. And then equally, they might have trouble with one or more aspects of expressing those things. So being able to retain vocabulary, find it when they need it, use grammar appropriately, or use their language to explain their thoughts and ideas in a more narrative sense. So somebody with DLD can be struggling with one or more aspects of those things. And then equally, the sort of social communication aspects of that, the functional application of language skills. So you can see, and this is where it can be quite confusing, diagnosing DLD, because inevitably, if you've got language difficulties, that will impact on how you present socially. So that's why differential diagnosis can be a little bit difficult. And as well as that, what we don't always see associated with it, but which is very much part of DLD, is your executive functioning sorts of difficulties. So short-term memory is an absolute classic thing, attentional difficulties, planning, initiation, all those sorts of things will often come with DLD too. So the difference between DLD and other diagnoses that might show some of the same characteristics is that the label of DLD implies that the language difficulty is not associated with any other condition. So there are lots of conditions that might be associated with communication needs, either physical ones, so cerebral palsy, cleft palate, that kind of thing. You'll see a lot of communication difficulties with autism, for example. And the label of DLD implies that the children have language difficulties, but not those other conditions. So those other conditions can definitely have language disorder, but you won't see it described as DLD, because that's the critical thing about DLD as a diagnostic label. The only exception to that being you can have a diagnosis of dyslexia or ADHD, with DLD, but we don't specifically. I see people getting confused about autism and language disorder. So normally, if you've got a language disorder that's associated with another condition, you'll see it being described that way. Language disorder associated with autism, for example. And the reason it's important to be so aware of DLD, like we were just saying, it's actually quite a common disorder. It's thought to be more common than autism. So 1 in 14, or that's 2 in the average classroom. And because as a clearly defined diagnostic label, it's not been around that long, it's relatively underdiagnosed, I think. Partly, sometimes that's about access to speech therapy services as well. But it can be quite tricky to identify because the nature of these children is that they're often quite cognitively able children. They've got lots of coping skills. They might have presented early on with language needs that were a bit more obvious, but they're kind of getting by. And so needs can emerge and become a bit more apparent a bit later, often when services are a bit thin on the ground. So you often see children being identified as having literacy difficulties, behavioural problems, and people are not thinking about the language side of that. And it's absolutely critically important we're identifying these children in education, particularly because we use language to teach absolutely everything we do in school, and it's the foundation of all our social relationships. So we know that children with SLCN generally tend to do worse in educational attainment, mental health, developing their friendships. They're more at risk of being in touch with the criminal justice system. So it's actually really critical we're identifying these children. And the role of the SENCO in particular, in terms of education staff and supporting families through that identification process, is particularly critical, I think, with DLD, because it can be relatively easy for those children to slip through the net.
There we go.
Oh, I don't know, can't get the stuff these days. Thank you, Anna. That was really useful to kind of give us that overview, and it leads us quite nicely on to question 2 that I have, which is for you, Martha. How do you explain DLD to parents or educators who are hearing it for the first time, and what are some of the key things that they really need to understand?
Well, first of all, I think explaining for the first time, I usually start with exactly what Angharad was saying, that it's really about how the child processes and uses language. I want to help them understand that DLD is a specific challenge with language development. Like we're saying, it's not a reflection of their overall abilities or their potential, or what that means for the future. But it does mean that they might need a bit extra help with their schoolwork. They might need a little bit of help with their peers, support to express themselves and to understand others. So I think keeping a focus on language development instead of broader concerns, we can keep the conversation really positive and productive, and it can feel less overwhelming, I think, for parents and teachers. When they hear that, they can start to feel more confident and empowered about, okay, how can we practically introduce some strategies that will support this child? So yeah, I think it's just keeping it quite focused on the language processing and understanding, and not kind of thinking about all the other possible things, and just staying on that track.
Thank you, Martha. I think that's quite difficult for parents, isn't it? Hearing something, because it's all of that anxiety. Did I cause this, or is it, what can I do to support it, and all of that. My third question goes to you, Yin. What are some of the kind of key signs that a child might have DLD, and how can teachers and parents begin that process of identification? Because we're not going to spring straight to a speech and language therapist. We can't find them for a start. 3 of you on this call, so I'm doing well today. But what are we looking for?
So, obviously, basically, that it is a language difficulty, as Angharad has explained in great detail. Thank you very much. But it can be affecting children in very different ways. So you might see particular difficulties in the use of language, or understanding language, or both, or certain strengths in some areas and certain needs in some others. And so, yes, it can be different according to for different children. Children don't don't have the same profiles. All children are very different in their presentation, and it can also differ according to their age as well. As a child gets older, their profile might well change. But some key things to think about, and Angharad has already mentioned many of these, are things like grammatical difficulties. So grammatical errors, areas that may not be something that you would expect for that age. For example, a child can go, she goed, and that might be okay for some younger children, but it can signify an issue for older ones. There could be difficulties with vocabulary. For example, children might use incorrect vocabulary when talking, or they can use vague terms, or they can seem like they're kind of grasping for certain words, not quite being able to say them. There could be things like word order being muddled up, or difficulties kind of recapping events or telling stories and that sort of thing, and making that can be quite difficult for the person listening to them to understand what they're trying to say. They could speak in much shorter sentences than their peers as well, because they haven't quite got that language structure, the kind of complexity of longer sentences. You might find also they have difficulties with following instructions. So a child might seem quite passive in the classroom, for example, or might do the wrong thing when a teacher gives a longer instruction. And all these things can kind of like basically be displayed in different ways. Angharad mentioned attention and listening difficulties as well, which, if a child is struggling with understanding what is being said to them, they might just lose focus. So they can appear quite distracted or just kind of not really paying attention. And of course, there's the impact as well, because language is so foundational to lots of different skills. So there could be an impact on behaviour, friendships, kind of maintaining and kind of forming those friendships, difficulties, memory, executive function, attainment, literacy. Literacy is very linked to spoken language difficulties and that sort of thing. In terms of how teachers and parents can begin the process of identification, it's really important that they have an awareness of DLD, what to look out for, and how important it is to identify it as well, how common it is, 2 out of 30, as we said, and the impact it can have on the children, impact on their quality of life and in future as well. Another thing that teachers and parents can do is to write down anything that they have observed, so it kind of builds a view of the child, a profile of the child. And it may well be that some parents might not notice some things that were hurt in the home environment that are quite obvious in the school environment, and that might be to do with the environment, or might be to do with the fact that maybe there's less understanding at home, for example. And it's really good as well to make sure that children know that if they do have any difficulties, if they do struggle with understanding what is being said or struggle to explain themselves, that they can talk about it, that they can feel safe and comfortable enough to talk about it, because that can help with the process of identification, and also help to support them as well if people knew that they were having difficulties in this area. One thing though, which is really important to mention, is that children can camouflage their difficulties, so they can mask, subconsciously or consciously mask their language needs. For example, if a child has been given an instruction in the classroom, or been told to do something at home, maybe they could copy their peers, or look at the gestures, look at kind of like the environment and context and that sort of thing, and use clues from that instead. And that's why it's really useful for schools to be using kind of identification via screening, for example. We're big at Speech and Language Link, we're really big advocates of using kind of screening across school entry stages, and our package has this. And it also, having this screening, we have a standardised screening where things like percentiles and standard scores can be provided, and that information can be printed off into a report, and therapists can have a little look into that and see whether it needs further investigation, the potential assessment for diagnosis as well.
Thank you, Ian. So I've kind of taken from the three of you so far is that DLD is lifelong. It affects comprehension and expression of language, and it's unrelated to other learning conditions, so it's not necessarily going to come along hand in hand with ASD or anything else. It can impact on multiple areas like literacy, social interaction, emotional regulation, behaviour. So they might be the things that we're seeing rather than necessarily seeing a language side of things. And that it is very often masked by stronger cognitive skills. So it's not linked to IQ in any way. We kind of may have somebody who's very intelligent and can talk very well about a particular subject focus, but can't have a day-to-day conversation with somebody. And that causes it to be misidentified or overlooked. And that we've got early signs to look for: difficulties with vocabulary, grammar, understanding instructions, following conversations, staying on track with everything. And that to kind of identify it, we're looking at those observation skills. So early observation, what's going on in the playground as much as what's going on in the classroom, screening as often, well, not as often as we can, but at the earliest opportunities, and not losing those opportunities, because I know a lot of children might enter our school not at the standard entry points, so not missing out on those students and screening them at that point as well, and having some pretty good assessments in place. Brilliant, thank you. I've got some nodding heads, so I was obviously listening for once. Sally, I'm going to come over to you, because visual tools are obviously very useful for children with a multiple variety of different needs, but they're certainly useful for students with DLD. Can you explain how widget symbols could support with those students? How can widget help us here?
Thanks, Abigail. So far we've discussed how children with DLD can struggle in terms of their understanding of and their use of language. When you add a visual to words and vocabulary, you're automatically giving that vocab meaning and context. And symbols specifically are clear, concise representations of concepts. There's no background or peripheral information that could cause confusion that you might get in a photo or detailed picture. So symbols give a real clear meaning. And by adding symbols to vocabulary, we're really helping that child to expand their vocab and be able to express themselves with greater clarity. I suppose you could liken it to being in a foreign country, not speaking the language, and struggling to communicate. But if you're presented with some symbols, then that can help in that process. It can help you to express your needs more easily. And I think through helping children to build their vocabulary, you're also helping in turn to help them develop their language structure as well. So children with DLD can find it difficult to find the right words and to formulate their ideas, those words in the right order. And so quite often systems are used such as colourful semantics to try and help with this. And again, by adding symbols to those types of systems, you are giving that clarity, giving that meaning, and then that in turn can help the child to access those systems and progress. It's been mentioned already around how children can sometimes struggle with their attention and listening skills as well. And as we're all aware, classrooms are really busy, fast-paced places where many words are being spoken 100 miles per hour. And that can create quite a confusing and stressful environment for lots of learners, not least those with DLD. And of course, words are transitory. As soon as they're spoken, they're gone, they disappear. And so giving that symbols, by introducing symbols into that environment, you are giving that permanent reminder, encouraging children then to have additional time to process information and then build that confidence and vitally help to kind of reduce anxieties. By adding symbols to written words, we are helping to reduce the cognitive load on working memory, thus freeing up more space to engage in what's going on, in the learning that's going on. I think it's important to note as well how the addition of symbols can help in other areas as well. So with, for example, building emotional understanding, if you can't express how you're feeling, if you don't have the vocabulary, then of course that can naturally be quite frustrating and quite a potentially upsetting situation to find yourself in. And so by adding the symbols in through symbolized emotions, for example, again, you're helping to build that understanding and helping that child to express their emotional state more easily. And that goes deeper still, because you can use the symbols to perhaps help the child explore what those feelings might look like, so what your body might be doing, how it might be feeling, what those early warning signs might be if you're feeling anxious. And you can use symbols for all of those things, as well as helping the child to learn strategies and select from different strategies that they could use to self-regulate. So lots of different ways really that symbols can support a child with DLD. And I think in a nutshell, classrooms that use symbols, classrooms that have symbols in whatever format, whether it is through visual timetables, communication boards, vocabulary maps, emotional regulation resources, the list goes on. But classrooms that have symbols in them can really help to promote a supportive, inclusive space for all learners, especially those who are experiencing DLD.
To me. Thank you, Sally. I think that what I kind of took away from that, though, as much as anything, was we know that DLD is lifelong, and we know that symbols are actually used not just in schools, but they're actually used outside of that. And I know you've just done some work with Nottingham City Transport to get the symbols used. They're used in a lot of football stadiums. So we know we're supporting people beyond just the classroom as well. So thank you. Okay, moving on to some conversation about intervention then, because, okay, it might be lifelong, but that doesn't mean we're going to write everybody off. We're going to still try and put some intervention in place and support those students. So, Angharad, I think I'm coming back to you again. What intervention strategies have you found to be effective, especially in a school setting? You know, my passion about it being school, not just what the speech and language therapist wants to do with one child, but what can we do in a school?
Absolutely. So I think on that score, really, I always try and draw the distinction between interventions and strategies. Interventions being kind of quite targeted things that often speech therapists might be doing, maybe outside the classroom, maybe in kind of one-to-one situations or group situations. And in terms of interventions themselves, DLD is quite a complex area, even for speech therapists, because there are so many different areas of language that can be affected, and because the individual profile of children with DLD can be really quite different from each other. So there's a very interesting range of interventions around DLD available to speech therapists. But from a strategy perspective, I think a strategy is much more about ways of reducing barriers to learning in the classroom. And I think the important thing to realise about classroom strategies is that inherently the classroom is a very language-based environment, and it's never not going to present a barrier to entry for our children with DLD. And so unlike interventions that might come and go depending on what skills we're trying to work on, strategies need to be there, exactly what you said, lifelong. The DLD is lifelong, and so the strategies we're using need to be lifelong too. Not necessarily always the same strategies, because children's profiles evolve as they get older, but very much thinking about strategies, as things that need to, like a seam that runs through our classroom activity, rather than things that kind of go in, fix a problem and go away again. And very much what Sally was just saying about, visuals, we need to be thinking about visuals as something that travels throughout our classroom environment over the years, even into secondary. So in terms of specific things, the things that I talk about most, one of the biggies really is actually, rather than always trying to add more understanding of language in the classroom, it's about reducing the amount of language we're asking children to process, so reducing the cognitive load associated with that, the amount of talking that's required. So a big one is just looking at how much talking you're doing. Adults are often pretty unaware of how much talking they're doing, how fast they're talking, how much they're talking in one go, the level of vocabulary they're using. So one of the big things that's in some ways quite easy to fix in a classroom environment, but actually really hard to get people to reflect on, is their own talking style, and the variables they can alter there in terms of supporting children's language processing. And then, of course, I wouldn't be a speech therapist if I didn't say visuals for all the good reasons that Sally said, and finding ways to adapt that over the life course of your student. Sometimes children go in and out of tolerating having symbols around. They feel a bit different with those symbols, and the way around that really is to make symbols and visual supports a much more integral part of our classroom, so they're not just some kind of glued on thing for that particular student. So there's lots of ways that symbols and visuals can help you, and I would hope that you'd have a relationship with a speech and language therapist who could help you problem solve how best to use visual supports in your classroom. I think a big one for our students with DLD is finding ways to give them more processing time, and that can be quite simple things like just asking them the question and telling them you're coming back in a few minutes' time. That can be as much as you need sometimes, but children can often give you really quite sophisticated responses that let them demonstrate their learning if you give them that little bit more time. So these are small things but big impacts. A big one for me is, as Ian was saying, a lot of our children struggle with their attention for lots of reasons. So supports that aid their attention, and also things that build their independence. I think one of the big risks for our young people with DLD is where they do have supports available, particularly in the form of adults in the classroom with them, they can become quite reliant on those, and we need to be planning to make them more independent with those support strategies as soon as possible, because there's not going to be a TA with them when they're in the workplace, and so we need to give them the tools and then plan to teach them how to use them themselves. So things that can help are things like just practical things like reducing the amount of noise, auditory noise, but also visual noise in your classroom. So that's about getting the balance right in terms of your visual supports and making sure there's not too much going on. Using consistent visuals is a big one. So that's where symbols are fantastic, because you're going to get the same picture every time, where it's not always the case with photos, for example. And visuals that focus children on what is required for them to do, not just necessarily individual vocabulary words, but visuals that support them to complete work. Things like graphic organisers are real big ones, especially as children get older, Key Stage 2 and beyond. I'm a big fan personally of using scaffolds to support children rather than having adults prompt them to complete work, having scaffolds like colourful semantics to help them with their sentence building, and particularly in an ideal world if your speech therapist is working on something in their therapy sessions with a child, and then you can carry over that scaffold into the classroom environment, perhaps with a vocab mat that's also colour coded as well. Then you can help that child be as independent as possible completing their work. For particularly with older students, very actively teaching study skills and note-taking and memory strategies, all those executive functioning skills that often don't come very easily to our students, and that skill area often gets missed, I find. So sometimes we have a bit too much focus on the individual vocabulary words, and we don't think about the functional piece of kind of helping the children learn about how they learn. A big bugbear of mine is when we punish students for saying that they don't understand or that they've forgotten. So a lot of my students get into trouble for not having understood what's required or saying, I don't remember what you said. But actually, that's a really important life skill. And for a lot of our students, I work very hard in some of my sessions to increase their awareness of when they're not understanding, because not understanding for them is pretty typical. And so actually increasing their awareness to the point where they can ask for help is actually very important. It's important we don't squash that skill in them. I find a lot of that is about raising awareness of DLD, though. You know, a lot of these behaviours can just look like poor attention and messing about if you're not aware of what the DLD is. And then lastly, a big one that speech therapists would mention a lot is very actively teaching vocabulary and pre-teaching and revisiting vocabulary, particularly cross-curricular vocabulary as they get older, that's going to help them to tackle things like exam questions. So, you know, words like evaluate and analyze, what do those words mean? And can we practice them in lots of different contexts? And particularly popular, especially in primary, are whole school and whole class approaches to vocab. So things like word aware and vocab ninja, I'm big fans of. So those are the things that I personally talk about in terms of classroom strategies all the time.
Thank you, Angharad. That was a really comprehensive list again of lots of different strategies and things. Everybody on the other side of this is thinking, oh, what am I going to add to that now? However,
I just saw lots of heads nodding.
Oh, lots of heads nodding. Okay, I can't see everybody when you come on. I'm going to come to you, Martha, because you've got a very unique business in that you deliver your therapy online, your speech language therapy online. So how do you ensure that those interventions are visual and effective and engaging for those students? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I do get quite less so now, I think, after the pandemic, but certainly when we first started as a company, there was a lot of, how are you going to do that online? How are you going to do that if you're kind of outside of the school and doing one-to-one sessions? I suppose we're a model that does work, like Angharad said. So we work more on the interventions. We do intervention work and we do the strategy work, but because we're online, we're able to increase the accessibility of having a speech therapist in the school. So we have a huge network of therapists around the country, and it means that when you were saying earlier, it's difficult to get 3 of us on a call. But you've managed to, because we're all sitting at different parts of the country and we're all here and we're connected by technology. So we really embrace the technology to bring specialists into the school. And it might be that we have DLD specialists. It might be that we have an autism specialist or a specialist in hearing impairment. So online therapy allows accessibility for a starting point. But when we're actually in the sessions, I suppose I was listening again there, and it's not, it's not that different is I guess one of the things. I suppose in the way, if we're talking specifically about Mabel and not just online therapy, we developed a platform specifically for the delivery of speech and language intervention for children. So it's not Zoom and it's not Teams and Google Meets. It's a specific platform that has games and activities integrated into it. But a lot of those games and activities and strategies are similar to what everyone else has been mentioning. So we do use lots of visuals, and we do use strategies like colourful semantics or shape coding, those kinds of things. But we have one of the things that we always say is, what can we do online that we can't do in real life to make it more special and more engaging? So I think that what we have uniquely is lots of interactive games and basically cool stuff that the kids really like to come and do in the session. And again, like these guys were saying, we make sure that we evolve whatever resources we're using along the child's therapy journey and in accordance with their age. So make sure it's really appropriate for who they are and their profile and what they're presenting with in the session. So, I mean, I feel like I'm going to be repeating things here, but, you know, we have things like interactive comic book stories, so we can map out social situations, and we can talk about conversations that might have broken down and how we would repair those, and just kind of work through really functional things. We have strategies that are similar to colourful semantics. We do picture sequencing, sentence building activities, essentially anything that you would do in traditional therapy, because we're still using an evidence clinical approach to everything. We would also as well talk about the child's advocacy. So again, like these guys were saying, about really building up the child so that they feel confident about asking for help and support in different circumstances. So from teachers, other members of staff, parents. So working on role play situations, that would be something that we would look at in sessions. And just having a little look at my notes here. I don't want to get too repetitive, so I'm skipping over a few bits, but yeah.
No, not to worry about that.
Did that answer your question?
It definitely answered the question. And
okay, lovely, brilliant.
It's giving us just a different idea of how the different services work. Because of course, Yin, you have speech and language link, which is very slightly different in that it's video content and it's designed for a TA to deliver within school rather than perhaps a speech and language therapist. But it's those three different approaches, but actually they're all doing the same thing. You're all coming about it, but in a very slightly different way. I'm going to go to my question 7. Do you know what? We're exactly on time as well. We're doing really well for this. So my next question is, collaboration is absolutely key in everything we do in special educational needs, but it's going to be key for students with DLD. What does effective collaboration look like between speech and language therapists, teachers, parents, anybody else who's involved? And this is open floor. It's whoever's going to unmute that microphone first and go, it's me that's answering.
Oh, no.
No pressure.
Gavin put on all panellists.
Did I put all panellists?
You did put all panellists. So
I just pick one because
I don't mind kicking it
there
off.
we go. Martha's going to go for it.
And again, I think I'm getting in there first because I need to have something to say, because I think we're all going to be on the same page about this. And
That's fine.
I
Go
think
for
it
it.
starts with really open, transparent communication and sharing goals, making sure that everyone involved with the child is on the same page. I hate the word, it's so dated, but working together holistically, it still applies. That's why we have to use it. And obviously making sure that as speech therapists, we do obviously, but really valuing listening to the parents and the teachers. They know the children, how they are in day to day. They see the challenges of different circumstances more than a speech therapist ever will. So we need to take on everything that they're bringing to our sessions and incorporating those challenges into our therapy plan and making sure that those are the things that we're working on and we're targeting, and that we're kind of supporting each other in that. And obviously regular check-ins, keeping everybody on the same page, making sure we're aligned, booking in those things ideally at the start of term for over the year, so that we can have it in a plan. It doesn't have to be a last minute kind of trying to get everyone together. If we just kind of get it in the diary, then we can make sure we're checking in. We can always cancel them if we don't need them, but if they're booked in, then we've got that time protected to talk to each other. So that would be my one ask.
I think that's actually a really key one, actually, because I certainly know, as I was a SENCO in the school, my diary used to fill up so quickly that if things weren't booked in advance, they very often did get forgotten or kind of pushed to one side. Well, that's not important. I'll try and fit it in at some point, or I'll try and phone Martha next week, and you never actually get round to it. You are right. Putting them in the diary quite early on is key. It's fundamental to things, and that communication amongst those multi-parties. As the SENCO, which most of the people on this call will be, as the SENCO, we are central to everything. We're the liaison point to the parent at one side of it, to the child here, to the teachers that side, and to the professionals who are working with that child, with that central point. So we have got to take control and book those things in. So yeah, definitely.
That's why you're in the middle.
That's why I'm stuck in the middle. There you go. You're all off the edges of me. Brilliant. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is, and it's for you, Yin.
You're not going to open it to anybody else?
Oh, did anybody else? No, because they're all nodding their head going, yes, Martha's going to answer all of this for us. Did anybody want to add anything to it? No. See?
Okay. Sorry, people.
I read the room. Okay, Yin, this one's for you. What advice would you give to schools that are looking to better support their students with DLD? And have you found any specific programmes or resources? Talk to us about Speech and Language Link, perhaps, that can support those students. What's helpful?
I think the most kind of important thing really is to think about awareness and recognition of DLD in schools. And that includes the senior leadership team as well, for them to be aware that DLD exists, that it is pretty common as well, and the impact it can have on the child's kind of quality of life and their future as well, the impact it can have on their attainment, literacy, and that sort of thing. And, you know, that would help people to the senior leadership team to kind of take it seriously and to prioritise kind of developing communication in the school. Another thing to think about in terms of better supporting students with DLD is to make sure that training does inform practice and that there is basically a kind of curiosity mindset as to what is going on. So what's potentially behind behaviour? Why is the child acting quite passively in the classroom? Is there something else? Is it language that could be a difficulty here? And also to kind of listen beyond communication difficulties too. So trying to get the best from the students, working out how to best support the students, and also making the students feel that they are being their best selves as well. Also mentioned is kind of the whole school approach, and it's something that Angharad has mentioned with her strategies too. So that's where schools can support all children, not just those with DLD, but also just kind of support across the board. And, you know, use of classroom supports, breaking down those instructions, using visuals and that sort of things, giving structure for children who might have difficulties with structuring their narratives, and, you know, making it quite explicit if children do struggle to understand what is being said in the classroom, making it okay for them to, you know, point to a symbol or say that they, or express themselves that they are struggling with what is being said, so that, you know, can incorporate the whole school approach. And it's also very nice because what this does means that the children with DLD aren't kind of differentiated so heavily from the rest of the population, because they are having those kind of universal symbols, universal strategies that are across the board for all children. It does help all children as well, and also kind of lots of opportunities for child-to-child conversation, so they can bounce vocabulary and, you know, be exposed to different sentence structures, different ways of saying things, that sort of thing is really great. And obviously, you know, we talked about collaboration as well, collaboration with parents and professionals too. These things are really, really important. In terms of the kind of programs and resources that are helpful, if the child is being seen by a speech and language therapist or has been provided with advice from a speech and language therapist, it's really important to follow what they're advising, follow their recommendations as well. And, you know, coming to these presentations and hearing views of therapists and what they would recommend in terms of programs and resources is well worth paying attention to. If you see that the child might have those particular difficulties in the classroom, the recommendations that can be given within these kind of presentations is very useful. And a little plug here, but for those that aren't being seen by a therapist or on a waiting list for diagnostic assessment, for example, we do have a package in our packages for language difficulties. There are resources and there are groups and there are even kind of individual supplementary teaching, which is a bit like precision teaching, that can support the children. And these are kind of flagged up by the screening and the assessment the screening tools to say which ones would be suitable for those children. And we have the impact studies that show that significant progress can be made for those children that are going through the groups and using those resources too. And we have the classroom resources and also things for parents as well. So there's advice for parents and there's information for parents as well. So all of that can be pretty helpful to support children with DLD.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really helpful. I just wish you just wouldn't mute me. That would help. Sally, I'm going to come to you just for a second and kind of spring a question on you. Within Widget, you've got, there's loads of things within there. There's symbols galore that I can type in there. I can start typing a sentence and it will pop up with the symbols for me. Is there anything else within the programme that could specifically support me as a SENCO or as a classroom teacher when I'm trying to produce resources for supporting my students with DLD or any other kind of need within the classroom?
Yeah, so I suppose just a bit of an overview of Widget. So we've got two main programs. So we have Widget Online, which is a cloud-based version, and we've got Imprint, which is a desktop. And yeah, both of them, they're really similar in that they both give you access to our symbol set, 20,000 plus symbols, and it's ever growing. So they're both really similar in that way. They also both have lots and lots of templates, several hundred templates. I couldn't give you the exact number. So sometimes you can look through those and that can give you somewhere to start from. You haven't got to kind of start from scratch. So there are templates that you can use to create things like your flashcards, that type of thing. There are templates in there that can help with things like colourful semantics. We've got a range of templates there that you can use. Other aspects really of Widget. There is a dual language aspect as well, which may be useful. There's also lots of ready-made resources in there as well. So again, if you're looking for kind of resources around particular curriculum areas, so there is a phonics pack, that's been developed according to the different phases. There is an autism support pack, which has lots of resources in there. It's been designed according to the 4 areas of need in an EHCP. So there's cognition and learning resources, resources around kind of routines. So yeah, there's lots to Widget. And again, I don't really want to plug, but we do free training, and so it's a really good place to start. If you wanted an overview, you could just jump on a free Zoom webinar and just kind of explore it a little bit really, and see what there is to offer, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I was using Widget prior to joining the company. I was a primary school mainstream teacher, and I was using Widget thinking I was using it quite well, and it wasn't until I joined the company that I realized actually there's a lot of other areas and things that I wish I'd known. So yeah, not wanting to plug, but just letting people know really what's out there.
No, absolutely. There's your opportunity to do that during this session. And you are right. Widget is one of those programs that looks deceptively simple on the surface. And then when you start using it, there's so many hidden bits to it. And the templates were what I was hoping you would mention there, because I know you can go in there. I'm doing a session on castles, perhaps, and I've got my key vocabulary. It's already there. But you guys also have a really good email list that goes out, and it sends out something like, we've just added a transition pack. I remember that one came out over the summer. And it's got some fantastic resources to support with that language development around transition sitting in there too. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Okay, so where am I going to next? I've lost my plot. No, I haven't.
You have lost the plot.
I haven't. No, I never had the plot in the first. I never had the plot in the first place. It is Angharad's turn again. She knows. Angharad, practical tips for parents. Because they're just exploring that world. They're dipping their toes in the water and finding it's a bit deeper and colder than they thought it was.
Just before I get on to answering that, I am quite happy to plug Widget Online, which is my particular favourite tool. What I would say is that I find one of the barriers that people have in their minds about using Widget or any other kind of visuals producing software, people worry about printing costs. And people worry about having to prep loads in advance. And I would encourage you, I think people get a bit too precious about visuals sometimes. And I would encourage you to think about having, being logged into Widget on your interactive whiteboard. You can type and, will it be absolutely perfect? It might not be, but it'll be a lot better than not using any visuals. And I certainly do a lot on the fly with students on my laptop and just log into Widget online. So I encourage people to not be put off by like this idea that all your visuals have to be pre-prepped and printed and laminated. I laminate nothing. You can still use it as a tool, even if you're a type B personality like me.
Save the environment.
Absolutely. So going on to parents, I think the first thing I wanted to say, which is what you said, Abigail, is that I would like to reassure parents that they do not cause DLD. That's, it's not that kind of difficulty. What we do know is that DLD can run in families. And so I suppose one of the big things to think about if somebody is talking to you about DLD in your child is it, might get you thinking about yourself or about other people in your family. And so it's important to really educate yourself about it, because you might find that there are things that other people, maybe your other children or a partner, might be struggling with that might point to DLD as well. I think for me, one of the big things I see with parents is that DLD is quite difficult diagnosis to wrap your head around, because unless you're a speech and language therapist, you've never really stopped to think about how impactful a language difficulty can be and how it can turn up functionally in so many different areas of your life. And children's profiles can be so different to each other. One child might have really significant comprehension difficulties, but another child might actually, their comprehension might be fairly sound and it's more of an expressive difficulty. And so I find that parents, if you're reading generic information about DLD, it can be really hard to work out what applies to your child specifically. So what I'd encourage you to do, one of the big things you can do, and I do understand it's easier said than done, but is try and develop a great relationship with your speech and language therapist, and don't be afraid to ask them questions. I think sometimes any professionals, we're good at giving information at the beginning when a diagnosis is given, and sometimes we don't take the time to revisit that conversation and let you kind of process and come back and ask more questions. So, take what you need from your speech and language therapist. It's okay to say, no, I need to have that discussion again. And the same with your child's school. I think having good relationships where you can, keep going back, much like you were saying about the collaboration, you go back to those core conversations with your school and your child's speech therapist and take what you need from them. You are an important part of your child's therapy journey. You're an important part of your child's development, obviously. And so I think it's easy, especially with systems as they are now, to get a bit kind of, especially once children are in school, a lot of their therapy happens in school, to kind of get pushed into the background a little bit as a parent. So don't feel, even if you don't feel you're a very assertive person, you don't have to be rude to anybody. You're not asking for something unreasonable. If you just ask for some time to take what you need out of the speech therapy process. So, and I think we're all busy people and we do sometimes forget to stop and have those conversations with parents. So, make sure that you feel well informed, because you're going to be your child's best advocate. And on a similar vein, getting really well informed about what your child's therapy is and how you can best support it at home. So I think sometimes people get a bit sidelined out of the therapy process if it happens in a clinic or school. Equally, I think sometimes people put a lot of pressure on themselves to turn their whole home into a therapy space and be doing everything and carrying over all the work at home. And I think there's a balance to be struck there that's right for your family, for your child, for you, and how much you can do. And that's where those conversations come from with your speech therapist, just being honest with yourself and with them about, how much can we do at home, what is most important to do, and are there any particular behaviours or learning areas that I really feel are crucial for us as a family that I would like to work on. So a lot of it's about having the confidence to have conversations with professionals, really. And then in terms of sort of more practical stuff at home, a big one, when your child comes home at the end of the day, the chances they're going to be pretty tired. They've worked really hard processing language all day at school. So a big one really is talking less. I know that's easier said than done, but any child, any person, if you're tired or you're emotional, you've had a long day, you're not going to be processing as well as you are when you're kind of wide awake. So, choosing your moments to have conversations, sometimes giving children some downtime, and then not overloading conversations with too much talk, if possible. Routines are going to be even more important for children with DLD because they are often quite reliant on routines to understand what's going on, and because the verbal explanations might not be retained or understood. So it's going to be even more important to have good routines in your household for your children and young people with DLD. And now that's easier said than done for teenagers who are often working against their own best interest in terms of getting enough sleep and stuff like that. But, trying to have good routines in place at home goes a long way. And on a similar vein, if changes in routine are coming up, giving yourself tools and time to explain what's going to happen, and making sure you're building in time to maybe debrief after changes, to have conversations with your child, just not just taking for granted they're going to be able to adapt and take on board verbal explanations very quickly. And like I said, I think the most important thing for me in terms of parents at home is getting well informed, and then you deciding what the right balance is for you in terms of how therapy works, how much you're going to do at home, and seeking out support for yourself that works for you. So there's loads of good information out there. I would recommend a few different places. A big one is RADLD, Raising Awareness for DLD, is a big source of really good quality information for parents. And they've got a really good social media account, lots of great posts out today, I noticed. The DLD project is also something I'd recommend, and they also have a great podcast. Speech and Language UK and Aphasic. They're all good sources of information. I would also encourage you to look after your own needs as a carer. It's really overwhelming, the SEND system and getting a diagnosis. And so whatever support is available in your local area for you as a carer, please seek it out so that you can look after yourself. I think that's really important.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Angharad. So on to our last question. It's a dive for that mute button again. Although you don't, it's Gavin that does it.
I've got mute on.
So looking ahead, what do you see as the most exciting developments in the field of DLD? Do you know of anything that's coming in the future? What are you hoping for in the future? Oh, Angharad's waving at me. Go on, Angharad.
I think firstly, raising awareness, things like this. We're talking about DLD. That's amazing. I know this makes me feel really old, but I've been a speech therapist for 20 years, and nobody knew what I was talking about when I talked about language 20 years ago in a school. And so just the fact we're having these conversations is completely awesome for me. And one of the good things I see coming out of that is adults getting diagnoses, and that they're going to support the generation coming through with DLD and tell us therapists what needs to happen for them. I think that's been a really positive development in the autism community, and I think the same thing will happen for DLD. And then the last thing is just the amount of research that's coming online about interventions. That's going to really improve what we can do as speech therapists. So I think there's lots of good reasons to feel positive about DLD.
Brilliant, thank you. Yun, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, building on from that, there's been quite a lot of talking to social media as well, and there are adults and young people that are coming forward and talking about their own experiences with DLD, and that's been really, really helpful, really good for the public to hear, how they've been dealing with having DLD when they've had diagnoses. Often these diagnoses are quite late as well, how it has helped their understanding, and also the support that they've got in the classroom and by certain teachers, those teachers are being mentioned. It's really lovely to hear that. So, as you say, it's lovely to see that there's so much more recognition, and that there are those advocates as well that are talking about their own experiences. It really does help spread that awareness. I was also going to talk about oracy as well. So there's been a kind of big push forward in terms of oracy, and there's been the Oracy Education Commission as well, who've been set up, and they talk about the new I think it's like the spoken language curriculum, isn't it? That is being planned, and that's really quite exciting. I mean, my concerns initially were, hopefully children with SLCN, which would include DLD, they won't be left behind, because oracy is basically the communication side, the presentation side, and being able to speak kind of publicly and having discussions and that sort of thing. So my concern at the beginning was, maybe with all these kind of aims towards them being able to do that, these children will really struggle. But there's been quite a nice report out called We Need to Talk. It's just kind of come out in October, or this month, and they've recognised that there might be children who would struggle with the oracy curriculum, and how we should be really aware that these children with SLCN, speech language communication needs, with DLD might have difficulties there, and that we've got to recognise that, and we've got to support those students as well. So all of that's kind of hopefully positive, and it sounds like things are going in the right direction there too.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Yen. So I think we've covered a massive amount of ground today talking about DLD, and SLCN kind of sits as that large umbrella over the top of it. DLD is one of the spokes of the umbrella, as a way of describing it. All of you have given us lots of really interesting information there. I've got a couple of key points I've kind of scratched on my phone as we've been going along. Early identification and intervention, we've said, absolutely crucial. So both Angharad and Yin, you highlighted that importance of robust screening, ongoing assessment, the need for teachers and parents to understand that those subtle signs, I suppose, as opposed to overt signs that we might see as teachers. Sally, you've given us some really great information about the power of visual aids, and Angharad, you've backed that up for us, and we know you're a massive fan of Widget anyway. You were so excited when I showed you an agenda that was printed with Widget symbols on it. I've never seen somebody so excited. That they can help our children get that permanent and clear way to process language, reduce that cognitive load, which we know is so important for multiple reasons, and support the working memory at the same time, and just give everybody a tool to communicate more effectively from us to the child and from the child to us at the same time as well. And then Martha, you've kind of picked up on that idea of effective support for children really does require that open communication amongst everybody. Those consistent strategies between what's going on at home, what's going on in school, what's going on in the classroom, the communication between all of those people. Abigail in the shooting post right in the middle and just spoking out to everybody and booking those meetings in. And that progress is only going to be maximised if everybody is actually on the same hymn sheet, if you like, and we're all singing the same song. Really looking forward to that growing awareness of DLD in the future. Hopefully that's going to, like I say, I hadn't heard of it 10 years ago, and I'm certainly hearing about it now. I'm not ashamed to admit that when I was first a SENCO, and it's now 29 years, my first year as a SENCO, I thought speech and language difficulties meant children with a short tongue who stammered slightly. That was my only experience of children with speech and language difficulties. It's definitely come on a very long way since then. I know a lot more about it, but DLD is certainly a new one within there for us. And that we're going to have that increasing advocacy from those adults who themselves have been diagnosed more recently and are able to advocate for themselves and therefore advocate for our youngsters and tell us what we need to do to support them. So I have to say thank you to all four of you today for giving up your time and sharing your insights with us. It's been an amazing session. Your expertise is, very much welcomed here. I think everybody's probably jealous of me. Sally, you're not a secret speech and language therapist, are you, by any chance? So I can say I had 4 of you on one call. That'd be great. But, 3 is great. It's all right. We'll go with 2 teachers and 3 speech and language therapists. We've done quite well out of that. Right. So thank you all very much for that. If you'd like to stay on the call for a couple of minutes, we'll have a word with you at the end. And goodbye to everybody who has joined us for today's session. Thank you very much.